When slavery was banned in the United States, slave owners were compensated for the slaves they freed. Since black slaves were considered commodities and properties, it was felt by the state that the slave owners could be at a loss. Hence, to give them their money back, President Abraham Lincoln signed the Compensated Emancipation Act. An average of $300 was given to every slave owner for freeing the black slaves. But what about compensation for the horrors, atrocities, and brutalities black slaves had endured? For over 2.5 centuries, black slaves worked in white households, plantations, and the worst possible conditions. They literally ran the American economy and developed it and its infrastructure. But they were paid nothing. They were only offered food enough to keep them alive. Who will compensate for that? Certainly, the U.S. has to make reparations to the black Americans whose ancestors endured the unimaginable. For centuries, this subject has been delayed, buried under complexities, and made to sound baseless. However, this will no longer happen. Slavery in the United States was a dehumanizing institution that treated Africans and African Americans as commodities, subject to being bought, sold, or traded. Approximately 600,000 enslaved individuals were forcibly transported to the United States, constituting 5% of the 12 million enslaved Africans taken during the transatlantic slave trade that started in 1526. During the early colonial era, slavery was practiced in Britain's colonies, including the 13 colonies that would eventually form the United States. Throughout the 17th and 18th centuries, people from Africa were abducted, compelled into slavery in American colonies, and subjected to harsh labor in the cultivation of crops like tobacco and cotton. Over time, millions of enslaved people were legally considered property in the United States, enduring brutal treatment and ruthless exploitation as a source of free labor. Their hard work played a pivotal role in establishing the United States as a dominant global economy. One historian estimated that by 1860, enslaved individuals were collectively valued at around $3.5 billion, making them the single largest financial asset in the entire U.S. economy, equivalent to approximately $115 billion today. In the antebellum South, enslaved individuals comprised roughly 13% of the Southern population. Many of them lived on large plantations or small farms, with some slaveholders owning fewer than 50 enslaved individuals. As the 18th century came to a close, the exhausted land used for tobacco cultivation precipitated an economic crisis in the South. The future of slavery in America became uncertain, especially with the nation's westward expansion and the growing abolitionist movement. This eventually ignited a heated debate over slavery, culminating in the devastating Civil War. Through forced labor, Black Americans generated immense wealth for their captors and the nation as a whole. However, they received none of the benefits themselves. Interestingly, the U.S. government recognized the need for reparations during that era and issued an order to distribute 40 acres of land and a mule to all formerly enslaved families, offering them an opportunity to build wealth and financial security. However, following President Abraham Lincoln's assassination, President Andrew Johnson adopted a different stance. He reversed Field Order 15, opting to return the land to former slave owners instead of providing black individuals with the means to support themselves. It was utter unfairness, evidence that racism and slavery were in the very roots of the United States. Essentially, the federal government empowered those who had once enslaved them. For instance, in Washington, D.C., slave owners were actually compensated for the lost property represented by the formerly enslaved. This practice was also prevalent in nearby states. Consequently, many Black Americans, who had limited work options, found themselves returning as sharecroppers to cultivate the very land that had previously been owned by those who had enslaved them. It's worth noting that slave owners not only profited from the enslavement of Black Americans, but also generated additional income from the land that the formerly enslaved had no choice but to work. Despite gaining their freedom, Black Americans were left without any form of wealth or sustainable means of livelihood. This marked the beginning of the wealth gap that endures to this day. In the aftermath of the American Civil War, state governments in the former Confederate states pursued measures to end the voting rights of Black citizens and enforce racial segregation. They aimed to prevent interactions between Black and white citizens in public spaces. To achieve these objectives, Black codes and Jim Crow laws were introduced at various points in the southern United States. Black codes were initially enacted in some states in 1855, severely curtailing the rights of Black individuals, many of whom had previously been enslaved. These codes imposed significant restrictions on the types of jobs African Americans could hold and their ability to terminate employment once hired. Additionally, some states imposed limitations on the kinds of property that Black people could own. Under the Black codes, many states required Black individuals to sign yearly labor contracts, with refusal leading to the risk of arrest, fines, and forced unpaid labor. During the period of Reconstruction, numerous Black men actively engaged in politics by voting and holding public office. However, Reconstruction officially came to an end in 1877, after which Southern states enacted more discriminatory laws. Efforts to uphold white supremacy through legislative means escalated, prompting African Americans to seek justice through legal challenges. Unfortunately, these efforts yielded a disheartening outcome in 1896 when the Supreme Court's ruling in Plessy v. Ferguson affirmed the constitutionality of separate but equal facilities, encompassing public transportation and schools. From that point until the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, discrimination and segregation were not only legally permitted but also actively enforced. African Americans faced social, economic, and legal discrimination, encountering segregated accommodations in theaters, hotels, and restaurants, or in some instances, outright denial of service. Therefore, in 1937, the initial edition of the Negro Motorist Green Book, a travel guide, made its debut. This guide was a resource for African American travelers, pointing them to establishments where they could expect to receive fair and unbiased service. During this era, segregated public schools created a stark divide in the quality of education that African American children received compared to their white counterparts. These schools intentionally offered an inferior education, marked by worn-out or outdated books, underpaid teachers, and subpar facilities and materials. Despite these challenges, the determination of Black Americans remained inexhaustible as they pursued financial freedom. Before the 20th century, numerous African Americans owned homes, farmland, and city properties. In fact, there existed a thriving Black Wall Street in Tulsa, a community characterized by a predominantly affluent Black population. However, as Black wealth grew, so did the prejudice, hatred, and jealousy of some white individuals. To thwart the accumulation of Black wealth, both the government and certain white Americans went to great lengths to undermine it. As Black individuals became more prosperous and acquired more property than ever before, jealous white individuals resorted to violence and deadly acts to uphold the notion of white supremacy. Organizations like the Tuskegee Institute and the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People documented over 3,000 lynchings that occurred between 1865 and 1965. Many of the victims of these horrific acts were landowners, and the objective was to eliminate Black wealth, seize Black-owned land, and perpetuate white supremacy. These lynchings were not limited to the actions of ordinary white citizens. Some white officials actually endorsed and supported this violence. Initially, these lynchings primarily targeted individual families, but in certain instances, entire Black communities were obliterated. Two notable examples include the racial cleansing of Forsyth County, Georgia, in 1912, and the tragic destruction of Black Wall Street in Tulsa, Oklahoma, in 1921. Black landowners faced immense pressure from both authorities and other citizens to abandon their land, effectively becoming refugees in their own homeland. Tax sales represented another method used to strip land from its rightful owners. Most of these landowners were Black individuals who wished to retain their property. However, they often lived on fixed incomes, rendering them unable to afford the annual property taxes. Once they failed to pay taxes, their properties were put up for auction, and developers frequently seized the opportunity to acquire land that these families had no intention of selling. Redlining constituted yet another strategy aimed at stifling Black wealth and impeding its advancement. In 1933, the federal government initiated a program designed to expand and segregate America's housing stock. This program primarily focused on providing housing to white middle-class and lower middle-class families, while systematically excluding African Americans and people of color from newly developed suburban communities, instead directing them toward urban housing projects. The term redlining finds its origins in a practice introduced during the New Deal era under the administration of the federal government. The government undertook the task of creating maps for every metropolitan area across the country, and these maps were meticulously color-coded. Initially, the Homeowners Loan Corporation pioneered this system, followed by the Federal Housing Administration, and later adopted by the Veterans Administration. These color codes were employed to communicate the level of safety or risk associated with insuring mortgages. Within this coding system, neighborhoods where African Americans resided, or even those near African American communities, were designated with the color red. This redlining served as a clear signal to appraisers that these areas were considered too risky for mortgage insurance. As a result, African Americans encountered insurmountable barriers when attempting to access quality housing and amenities. The FHA's reasoning behind redlining rested on an unsubstantiated assertion that if African Americans were to purchase homes in these suburbs or their vicinity, it would lead to a devaluation of properties in predominantly white neighborhoods with insured mortgages. However, this argument lacked any empirical foundation and did not align with reality. In actuality, when African Americans sought to buy homes in all-white or predominantly white neighborhoods, property values often increased. African Americans were willing to pay a premium for properties due to their limited housing options, which in turn drove up demand. The substantial disparity between the wealth of African Americans and white individuals today can be primarily attributed to federal housing policies that were implemented throughout the 20th century. While African American incomes, on average, amount to roughly 60% of the average white incomes, African American wealth represents only 5% of white wealth. Here's a reminder to please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. In the United States, the wealth of most middle-class families is predominantly derived from the equity they hold in their homes. Therefore, the significant gap between the 60% income ratio and the 5% wealth ratio can be predominantly traced back to these federal housing policies. African American families who were prohibited from purchasing homes in suburban areas during the 1940s, 50s, and even into the 60s due to FHA policies were denied the opportunity to benefit from the equity appreciation experienced by white families. Communities like Daly City in California or Levittown and similar developments nationwide offered homes in the late 1940s and 1950s that were priced at roughly twice the national median income. These homes were affordable for working-class families with FHA or VA mortgages. African American families possessed the financial capability to afford these homes, just like their white counterparts, but were unjustly prevented from doing so. Today, these very same homes are often sold for prices ranging from $300,000 to $400,000, which is 6 to 8 times the national median income. When the Fair Housing Act was enacted in 1968, finally allowing African Americans to purchase homes in the suburbs, it had already become financially unattainable for many Black families. Meanwhile, white families continued to acquire these homes, benefiting from the equity and subsequent accumulation of wealth. White families utilized their home equity to finance their children's college education and support their elderly parents, achieving financial independence without relying on their descendants. African Americans, for the most part, were denied access to the advantages that come with homeownership and the accumulation of wealth. They often found themselves barred from purchasing homes in suburban areas, a historical reality that has contributed to the significant wealth gap that persists between Black and white families. This gap shows no signs of narrowing anytime soon. To compound matters, Black Americans not only begin with less wealth than their white counterparts, but also face greater challenges in climbing the economic ladder and are more prone to economic setbacks. In 2019, the median wealth of Black households in the United States was $24,100, while that of white households was $18,100. This means that the typical Black household held only 12.7% of the wealth of the typical white household, resulting in a wealth deficit of $165,000. Although the average wealth gap may seem somewhat smaller in relative terms, it becomes considerably more substantial when measured in absolute dollar amounts. On average, Black households had just over $142,000 in wealth in 2019, compared to over $980,000 for the typical white household. This translates to Black households possessing only 14.5% of the wealth held by white households, with an absolute dollar gap exceeding $838,000. The persistent wealth disparity between Black and white Americans is a direct consequence of a discriminatory economic system that systematically obstructs Black households from achieving the American dream. This system has historically made it exceedingly difficult for Black families to acquire and preserve capital, resulting in a deep and enduring racial wealth divide. Barriers to wealth accumulation for Black households have persisted for centuries and remain a fundamental issue today. Given the self-perpetuating nature of wealth accumulation, it becomes increasingly improbable for Black Americans to catch up to their white counterparts without substantial public interventions. After enduring centuries of oppression and systemic barriers to wealth creation, white households are considerably more likely to receive substantial inheritances from their parents and grandparents, often significantly larger than those received by Black households. Additionally, white households tend to have access to more extensive and prosperous social networks, providing them with job and career opportunities, both for themselves and their children. Addressing the persistent wealth gap between Black and white Americans necessitates confronting the deeply ingrained institutions that have historically obstructed Black households from building and growing wealth at the same pace as their white counterparts. This is where the concept of reparations enters the discussion. Reparations, as a means of addressing the historical injustices endured by Black Americans, are not a new idea. It has been the subject of debate, advocacy, and legislative proposals for many years. One prominent example is the H.R. 40 bill, which has been introduced in various sessions of Congress since 1989. The bill, officially titled the Commission to Study and Develop Reparation Proposals for African Americans Act, covers its purpose. It seeks to establish a commission tasked with examining the enduring impacts of slavery and discrimination and formulating potential solutions in the form of reparations. Despite multiple introductions, the H.R. 40 bill has yet to advance into law, underscoring the complexities and challenges associated with the reparations discourse. The issue raises crucial questions about the appropriate forms of redress, the mechanisms for implementation, and the broader significance of addressing historical injustices within a diverse and often divided society. Advocates argue that reparations are vital to acknowledge the enduring legacy of slavery and systemic discrimination, as well as to provide compensation for the economic, social, and psychological harms inflicted upon generations of Black Americans. Over 250 years, the United States witnessed a painful history that included brutal slavery, followed by periods marked by Black codes, Jim Crow laws, housing discrimination, and various systemic racism practices. All of these historical factors have culminated in a disturbing wealth gap between Black and white households in the country. To put it in perspective, during the last decade of the 19th century, the median white American in their late 50s possessed 250 times more wealth than the median Black American. Although the pace of decline in the white to Black wealth ratio slowed, it took another 50 years for the gap to reduce by half again. Discriminatory laws and policies emerged, hindering Black social, political, and economic progress. Black individuals face significant challenges due to unequal pay and limited access to capital, making it difficult for them to save, invest, and accumulate wealth. The topic of reparations is a subject of considerable debate. Some argue that reparations may not effectively address the difficulties of historical injustices, and suggest that alternative approaches, such as investments in education, healthcare, and economic opportunities, could have a more profound impact. Opponents of reparations express concerns that it could further divide the nation and raise questions about eligibility, whether all Black Americans should receive compensation or only descendants of those who can trace their ancestry to slavery. Additionally, they question the notion of taxpayers funding reparations, given that no one alive today bears responsibility for historical injustices like slavery. Economist William Darity, a co-author of the book From Here to Equality, which outlines a comprehensive plan for material reparations, firmly believes that reparations targeted at closing the racial wealth gap represent the most effective way to address the historical and current disparities in wealth within America. According to Darity's estimation, achieving this goal would necessitate an expenditure of around $350,000 per eligible recipient. Under Darity's plan, direct payments would be made to approximately 47 million Americans who identify as Black. To qualify, individuals would need to have identified as Black, Negro, African American, or Afro-American for at least 12 years before the reparations plan takes effect. They would also be required to provide evidence of at least one ancestor who was enslaved in the United States. One method of establishing this ancestry is by referring to census records. If an ancestor appears in the 1870 census and was of an age to have been alive in 1850 or 1860, but cannot be found in the earlier census data, it implies they were likely enslaved. This is because enslaved individuals were not included in the census before the abolition of slavery through the 13th Amendment. While Darity's plan has garnered support, it faces opposition, particularly regarding the eligibility of Caribbean people residing in the United States and specific groups within the Black community to receive reparations funded by the U.S. government. Regardless of these varying viewpoints, the call for reparations to address the profound injustices endured by Black African Americans through slavery, racial discrimination, and hatred represents a matter of moral and social responsibility. The historical evidence of centuries of suffering and systemic oppression cannot be dismissed. Despite differing perspectives on reparations, it is crucial to recognize that implementing reparative measures, even in the form of enhancing educational facilities, healthcare access, and housing for Black individuals, can contribute to bridging the divides that have long plagued our society. However, the U.S. government and the state itself have done nothing practical for reparation. The Black Americans are the citizens of the United States, and getting reparation is their right, which has to be given. Detailed plans are already presented, yet various governments just touched on the topic and left it when they got enough fame through it. Perhaps Black Americans should ensure that they get a guarantee before electing any president that reparation will be made. A study in the review of the Black Political Economy Journal reports that if all the factors of slavery are taken under consideration and monetary equivalent is calculated, the U.S. owes approximately $151 million to every Black American. Now you can understand why the U.S. does not discuss this matter. Even if $151 million is not paid, at least $350,000 has to be paid to every Black American. Do you think Black Americans should be paid the reparation money? Isn't it true that no matter how much this subject is delayed, reparation has to be made as it is inevitable? Let us know how Black Americans should demand reparation in a way that is noticeable and the state is left with the only option to pay it. Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If yes, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.